Okay, hello, good morning. I was a little bit late today, so I thought I had like tons of time, but obviously I didn't. Okay, so we're going to take a small detour this time, because I was thinking a little bit this weekend, had a discussion, because, let's see, let me just find the project first. Oh, don't I have it here? Oh. Sorry, I'm messing up. I'm just going to open, let's see, codes. We are going to design an API together, and we're going to, oh, this is my temp. We're going to design it for stitches. Okay, so I'm going to try to explain this. I had a discussion, like in Code Sandbox, we're using style components. And then we have our component system on top of that. And then we're also using something called system UI on top of that to handle tokens and stuff. And what we've noticed is that we're getting some performance issues, actually. And that made me think about, I thought about styling and stuff for a long time. I also have some videos on dynamic versus static styling in CSS and JS and stuff like that. But it hit me this weekend where the issue starts to happen. So how should we do this? Maybe we can, let me try to make this a little bit bigger. And let's write some TypeScript React here. Okay, so the way you use style components is that you have this thing where you can like create a button and you say like style button, and then I'm going to use the object syntax here, and then you can say like color red, and then you can just use that button, and related to TypeScript and stuff, you get like the proper attributes here. So you can say like disabled, and that's like properly typed. Yes, but the thing is that we don't build static applications. There's no such thing as a static application. It's dynamic, which means that also our styling is dynamic. The question is, how do you express that? I think the CSS and JS libraries has taken one step too far recently. Well, not recently, but in terms of making them too dynamic. So first of all, the first part of the dynamic nature was, for example, if you wanted that color to be dynamic, you would do something like this. So you would pick up the props here. So you would maybe say is awesome, and then you would say is awesome, it's red, or it's blue, for example. Now, this actually changed later on to become something like this instead. Let's see. Bloop, bloop, bloop. Yes. And then you could like pass in is awesome. Yeah, for example, like that, and it would change its color. Now, one problem with this dynamic nature is that it needs to be evaluated every time. So whenever this button is used, it needs to pass in the props, and it needs to evaluate how the styling definition looks like, and then it has to figure out, like parse that object that's returned to figure out how to build the styling there, and if it's actually needed to update the styling of the browser. So you have like triple reconciliation kind of thing going on. You have React's reconciliation, then you have the reconciliation of producing the dynamic style, and then you have the reconciliation of actually adding it to the browser. Yes. And another thing with this approach is that when you start allowing passing props into a solution like this, these props are actually passed down to the button element. So this button would actually in the DOM look like this. And it would start getting like errors and stuff because that's not a valid attribute for an element. And this is actually an unsolved problem. today. And I'm saying like there are solutions for it, but I'm saying it's unsolved because I don't think the solutions are good enough. So for example, in style components, the last time I checked, they were talking about having special properties. So like P is awesome, for example. If you did that, the P dash would indicate that this is a special prop that should not be passed down to the DOM. For me, that's not like the ideal solution. Another thing is that when you create the style thingy, you would rather like create it like this, and then you would say like is awesome is awesome, and then you have the rest of the props, but then you kind of have to manually add them, which is like, why do you even have style then? You don't really need that. You could just create a component. What I mean is you could still have your style button element, and that would be static, no dynamic there, and then your button would just be a normal component. Button element. So what I mean is that it's adding additional API. It's gone too far where it's unable to express the intention of the developer, and then adds a bunch of API on top to try to handle it, but it just becomes very, very complex. Whereas the more direct, more low-level implementation actually makes more sense, in my opinion, like you see here. Yes, and then we have something else that has, well, yes, so let's move on with the dynamic nature. So one thing is our color here. So it's either awesome or it's not awesome, meaning it can produce two different styling. But then you have like crazy dynamic stuff, like left. So you might pass in left here. And that left value can be anything, meaning that for every single value of left, it will produce new styling for it, and it will overload completely with class names and stuff. So we actually do need inline styling in our applications with the dynamic nature they have, because you want to drag stuff around and do all sorts of crazy stuff where inline styles makes perfect sense. But in the current CSS and JS libraries I have seen, there's no handling of these two kinds of styling. And you could argue that the color like is awesome, and this is the tricky part. So the first one, color, red, blue, the first one, that's an okay dynamic behavior because it will only produce two different class names. But the one underneath is not okay because it will produce a ton of different class names. So how do you differentiate them? Because in the API they look exactly the same. And that's not ideal at all. Yes. And then we have this other concept that popped up, which developers need, and that is the ability to change out the underlying element. So if we have our button element here, but for some reason we need this to be a link. So we want to say button element as A. So this will be like a tag. And then we actually want, in terms of typing, we want attributes to change. So when I have a button element, disabled is perfectly okay. But if I change to hyperlink, now suddenly href is an allowed attribute. And this is called polymorphism or something. I don't really care, it sounds too fancy. But it's super nice, and it's a powerful thing, and I can understand why as a developer you would want that. So that's kind of like something that popped up later, like after we allowed props like this. And then we also have this other thing that has, I guess it's been around for a long time, but I haven't seen it that much in like CSS and JS style components kinds of variations, which is variant. So what you really want is to say that the styling you give by default is like the primary variant or default variant. And then you want to say something like secondary. And then you apply some overrides under the hood, which are probably multiple styles. And this thing, I think, is the key to make this a better experience. Because what I think is necessary is that you can't make these APIs dynamic, because it's just allowing you to pass props into them is the thing that opens the can of worms. As mentioned, you don't know when it's safe to use that prop to create dynamic class names. As I mentioned, if it's like a boolean, it's okay. If it's a number, that can be any number, it's not okay. Yeah, so you don't know like when should I use like inline styles and when should I use them. And then you have the thing where it passes it down to the DOM element. There's no really good solution to that. I've seen like Emotion has where you can add like a second object where options like forward props, and then you kind of name the stuff. And this is like you're just patching on top of it. There's an underlying problem there that it's really, really difficult to solve. Okay, so this was a lot of introduction, but I had all of this stuff on my mind, so I had to talk about it first. Because what we're going to do is create an API, because Stitches already has styled. Stitches style already has this API, but it's also based on props, and it also has its set of issues. So the way styled handled the passing of the props down to the DOM is that you had like a first thing here. So you would say is awesome, and by default it's false. And now you've explicitly said that is awesome is a property I'm going to use in my styling, which means that it doesn't pass that down to the underlying element. But this is also like throwing some patching on top of it. It's not really ideal. It extends the API and stuff. So what we are going to do is to, let's see. Yeah, and also just to show you how the API looks today. And since Stitches uses this compose thingy, it looked more like this. Yes. So what we are going to do to this Stitches API is that we're going to change it a little bit. It already gives the it already has this polymorphic typing, so you can do like as thing, but it doesn't have variants. And as I said, I think this is the key to solving it, because you do want dynamic behavior, but you want that dynamic behavior to be controlled from the outside. You ideally want your elements, the styling of the elements, to be completely static, because that is predictable in terms of evaluation. So you can like define your button element outside of all your components, and then it's evaluated, and it's never evaluated again because they're static. So what you rather do is that you flip the variance. And the way I thought we could do this, and sorry if this doesn't make sense right now, but I hope it will. First of all, we're going to allow object syntax. So Stitches is very low level. And the reason it doesn't have object syntax is because it's an overhead. It needs to like look at the object, go through the keys and everything. As when you do this, it instantly just does it. So it's just faster. But that doesn't mean like it's slow if you add an object on top. It was just meant to be low level. So we are going to allow this kind of syntax. In terms of selectors, we are going to allow doing this kind of thing. And what we're going to do, like in Stitches, we have screens. So we are going to allow you to do something similar like this, where if you have like a screen called mobile, you are allowed to write mobile. And then you can give it like another color, like that. And then I guess you should also be able to do like hover inside here. We'll have to explore exactly how nested this stuff should be. But anyways, you should be allowed to do that. Purple. And the point is that we are going to just translate all of these properties into, so for example, what we're seeing here would look something like CSS color red. Oh, sorry. CSS compose, CSS color red. Then it will be CSS color blue when hover. Oh man, hover. And then it will be CSS mobile color green, and so on. So we're just going to translate that. So that's nice. And then we are going to give a second argument. And I haven't seen this in any libraries yet, but I have a feeling that it might pop up because of the performance stuff I'm talking about. And that is to give a second argument of variance. So let's clean this up a little bit. So let's say we have color red, but then we want a variant called secondary. And on that secondary variant, we want the color to be blue. And what happens now is that it will automatically type this. So what you give as a first argument is the base styling. And then you don't have to give it a variant, which means that it uses the base styling. But if you do write variant here, it will pick up the keys here. So secondary would be a valid variant. And then it would apply the styling there. But it's adding, like in terms of stitches, it just adds a class name. And then it handles the specificity and everything just as normal. And if you wanted to make this dynamic, now let's say we have an is awesome prop in whatever component is using this, you would rather do this, is awesome. You would say like secondary or null. So you do it on the outside, which means that when this is defined, it's defined outside all components. You don't like do it inside a component, and it doesn't do any new evaluation. It's already evaluated everything. So the only thing it actually does when you pass this in is to choose if it should add the class name of secondary or not. And as I said, the specificity is already handled there. And then you might say, okay, but I want a variant called disabled. And when it's disabled, it should be like gray. And now you, maybe you have like a variable called is disabled. Well, let's say you want that button to be disabled. And typically, like with style components and stuff, you could now give the color gray by looking at the prop disabled, but you can't do that anymore here. You would actually have to give it the variant as well. So you would have to say is disabled, let's see, is disabled. You would say disabled, or you wouldn't give it anything, for example. So this is like, you could argue that this is bad. It should be based on that prop. And yeah, I agree. That's would maybe be ideal. But then we open up the can of worms again. And it's about the developer experience kind of thing. You just want everything to be as automated as possible. But that's not what we're allowing here. You have to use this variant to actually style it, and then all other props are like, it's irrelevant. Those are DOM attributes. This is the styling. Okay, so that's one part of it. And then another thing that I see, like I don't work that much with styling. As I said, I'm not good at styling. Where I kind of look at things is in terms of performance and implementation. And I've seen these trends of like putting stuff on top, and does it really, where does it, what part of the API has like a cost benefit thing, where the cost is starting to become higher than the benefit? And this is one of them, in my opinion. Okay, So now we have like a variant. We only have static styling. So if you want to do something dynamic, you have to use a style attribute. Now, the problem is that I've seen in these, like even in Code Sandbox, that the style attribute becomes too simple because you don't have selectors and stuff there. So what I've seen is the use of this CSS prop thingy, where you are able to do like inline styling with all the selectors and everything. So you can do like color blue, which is, again, it's for the developer experience. But it has an issue, and that is because every single time the component renders, it has to first create this object and produce the styling. Then it passes that in. It needs to evaluate all of these things inside the styling library, and then it needs to evaluate if it should add a rule or not. So the way I think we should solve this is to allow you to pass in, let's see, so you have style. We could call it like override, or it has to be some kind of property. I thought about calling it styled because it kind of reflects the thing here. And what you would be able to do is to say my override. So we're not like pointing to an element here, we're just calling styled, and that just gives you some styling. So we could say color blue, or maybe we should do something else, background color tomato. So when you have this button element, you are able to pass in a styled property. And the point is, like the secret sauce here, is that inside the button element, it will actually check if this object changes. As I said, now you aren't able to do anything dynamic here. So we know that the object you pass in here, that needs to be the same every single time, because it can't be dynamic. Yeah, so instead of doing like style, if you were to do this, we would actually be able to throw an error at you and say that, hey, you're passing in a new object every single time you're trying to override this element. But you shouldn't do that. You should move this definition outside of your, outside of your component, because then it passes in the same reference every time. And again, since it's static, it's okay to throw an error there. So the only scenario this wouldn't handle would be like if you were to do like, is disabled my override, my other override. Like it wouldn't be able to do that. So that's like the limitation. But now we're getting to such a crazy edge case where you could handle it completely differently. Like you would have two different button elements, for example, because now they're starting to become so different that I don't see any reason why they should even be the same element. But this is the kind of thing that's difficult about API design. It's giving restrictions to the point where it is possible to solve the edge cases by going around the API. As I said here, you could just create a new button element. And then you want to give the power of flexibility, but not to the point where it gets confusing, which is why I think the current CSS and JS APIs has taken the wrong turn by actually consuming the props. Yes. Okay, this was a long rant. I actually hope we got to start doing some coding, but this just became one big rant. Okay, but we're going to try to do this. Maybe we can start. Okay, we have a few minutes here. let's see what we can do about this. Let's look at the current implementation in Stitches. So we have the different packages here, where CSS is the core package, and then we have styled, which is the thing we're going to change. And it's actually quite simple. It's like 100 lines of code where some of it is typing. So what we would do here is start changing the typing. As I mentioned previously, this is how I work with libraries that are typed. I work with the typing first to expose the API I want, and then I just implement it, and I do some hacks around TypeScript and stuff if it isn't able to infer the exact thing I want to expose. Because for the consumer, it doesn't matter what the typing is inside the library. It's only the exposed typing that matters. But yeah, so this is what we're going to change around. Yeah, cool. But I think instead of going into that, I think I want to show you something. Because last time we were doing hot reloading of our code. And let's see, week planner. But there was an issue, because when we changed, oh, there's a new version. When we changed configuration of our styling, it didn't hot reload. But if, let's see if we can get that running, CSS. So if I were to change, oh, I have this open in a different tab somewhere. If I were to change this to red, like, it wouldn't update. And this actually turned out to be an issue inside Stitches, because it supports hot reloading, but it doesn't update itself. CSS 211. Yeah, I think that's the one. Let's see if we can get this to work. Let's just refresh just to be sure. And if I do green now, yeah, now it changes. And what's kind of cool about this is one thing is going in here and changing, like, yeah, I don't think we have much to show for here. Like, if I go in here on auth, log in for an awesome experience. So doing this is really, really nice. Like, being able to just save and it instantly pops up, and we can do styling and all that stuff. But then going into, like, the definition of your styling, your style guide or whatever you want to call it, and being able to actually change it out here as well, and you see everything change related to that, is super powerful. So yeah, I just wanted to show you that that's actually fixed. So when we do eventually move on with our application, we have the possibility to tune the UI by just going through this config, and we see it kind of live updates, which is really cool. Okay, so tomorrow I'll see if I find some time today to get started with refactoring the Stitches, so we can try out the new API, because I really want to try it out in this app. And this is just pushing it, as Max Stoiber, the creator of Style Components, said, like, 2020 is the year where we figure out CSS and JS. I'm not sure about that, but this is at least a perspective that might help others to at least reflect on the current APIs. Like, have we gone too far with these APIs? This dynamic nature we have put into the libraries, they have a high cost, and maybe that cost should not be inside the library. Yes. Cool. I guess that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow. There we go.